Parents cut me off when I married my husband, but now that I'm pregnant, they're trying to reconnect. So I'm 28 and female, and I've always had a tough time with my parents, especially because of their sky-high expectations. Growing up in this swanky suburb, it felt like I was always being compared to my older sister Amber, who's 30 now. Amber was basically perfect, straight A's in school, and now she's killing it as a lawyer at a fancy firm in New York. Meanwhile, I was more the artsy, free-spirited type. I did okay in school, but was way more into art and literature than math and science, which were my parents' jam. Our family is old money. My dad, Richard, who's 60, is super loaded, and my mom, Rose, 58, comes from a wealthy family too. She spends most of her time doing charity stuff, mostly for the socializing rather than the actual philanthropy, if you know what I mean. They've always been obsessed with keeping up our social status and connections. Seriously, from the moment I was born, they had my life all mapped out. Ivy League school, preferably Harvard like Dad, major in business or law, marry some rich, well-connected guy, and eventually take over the family business with Amber. Yeah, not my thing at all. I was always more into painting, writing poetry, and hitting up museums. My parents thought these were cute little hobbies, but not exactly career material. They pushed me into what they thought were more suitable activities: tennis lessons, summer internships at Dad's company. I went along with it to keep the peace, but never felt like I fit into their world. When I got into Brown University, they were kinda let down that it wasn't Harvard, but decided it was good enough. They figured being around the right kind of people would finally set me on their preferred path. Little did they know, it led me to Chad, who changed my life forever. I met Chad, who's 29, during my sophomore year at Brown. We literally ran into each other at the campus coffee shop, spilling hot coffee everywhere. Instead of getting mad, he just laughed and said, "Well, I guess this is one way to break the ice." We ended up skipping classes and talking for hours. Chad was everything my parents would disapprove of, which made him even more appealing. He came from a working-class family in Ohio. His dad was a factory worker, and his mom was a waitress. He was at Brown on a full scholarship and worked part-time jobs to support himself, studying to become a teacher because he was passionate about education and making a difference. From that first meeting, I knew Chad was special. He was kind, funny, and incredibly hardworking. He made me feel seen and understood like no one else ever had. With Chad, I could be my true self, not the polished, perfect daughter my parents wanted. We started dating, and I finally felt genuinely happy. Chad encouraged my art and supported my dream of becoming a graphic designer, unlike my parents, who dismissed it as silly. Eventually, I had to introduce Chad to my parents during junior year's parents' weekend. Total disaster. My parents couldn't see past Chad's background. They made snide remarks about his clothes, his accent, and his career choice. My mom kept asking if he was sure he wanted to be just a teacher, and my dad barely spoke to him, clearly disapproving. They were convinced he was after our money and status. When I defended Chad, my dad just said, "Oh, honey, don't be naive. Boys like that always have an angle." Despite my parents hating him, Chad and I kept dating. We supported each other through late-night study sessions, celebrated our achievements, and dreamed about our future. When Chad proposed during a camping trip, it wasn't the grand affair my parents would have expected. We were sitting by the campfire under a starry sky, and he said, "I know I can't give you the life of luxury you grew up with, but I promise to love and support you in everything. Will you marry me?" I said yes without a second thought. Breaking the news to my parents was chaos. My mom cried about how I was ruining my life, and my dad ranted about my biggest mistake. They gave me an ultimatum: break up with Chad, or they'd cut me off completely. No financial support, no trust fund, no inheritance. My dad said, "If you're so set on living like a commoner, then do it without our money." I was devastated, but realized their love was conditional on me fitting their mold. So, I chose Chad. We had a small, perfect wedding with close friends. Amber didn't even show up. She sided with our parents, saying I was making a mistake. The next day, I got a cold letter from their lawyer, kicked out of the will, Amber as the sole heir, and I was no longer welcome at home. Any attempts to contact them would be dealt with legally. It hurt more than I thought it would, not because of the money, but because my own family chose status over my happiness. For 3 years, I tried to reach out, letters, voicemails on holidays and birthdays, but they ignored me. Eventually, I gave up. Chad and I built our life during those years. working hard and supporting each other. So, I work as a designer at this small advertising agency, and Chad teaches high school English. We bought this cozy little house in a pretty modest neighborhood and even adopted a rescue dog named Max. Honestly, life was good. Sure, we didn't have the fancy stuff I grew up with, no lavish vacations or designer clothes, and we had to budget pretty carefully. But love and respect were our real luxuries, and that felt way more valuable than any amount of money. For the first time, I was living genuinely, chasing my own dreams instead of living up to someone else's expectations. 3 years after our wedding, I found out I was pregnant. Chad and I were absolutely overjoyed. We hadn't been actively trying, but we both wanted kids and couldn't wait to start this new chapter. We decided to wait until after the first trimester to share the news, just to be on the safe side. About a week after we started telling friends, I got a text from Amber. It was the first time I'd heard from her in 3 years. The message was straight to the point. Mom and Dad heard about the baby. They want to talk, call them. I was floored. How did they even find out? I hadn't told anyone in my family, and as far as I knew, we didn't have any mutual friends who could have spilled the beans. Chad and I talked it over, and I decided to call them. Maybe the idea of being grandparents had softened their hearts. When I called, my mom picked up on the second ring. The conversation was super awkward. She did most of the talking while I could hear my dad breathing heavily in the background, occasionally grunting in agreement. She congratulated me on the pregnancy and then, without any apology or acknowledgement of the past 3 years, started talking about wanting to make amends and be part of their grandchild's life. Then, out of nowhere, she started listing all these extravagant gifts they wanted to send: top-of-the-line stroller, custom-made crib, designer baby clothes, even a new family car. It was mind-blowing. These gifts would easily cost over $10,000. It felt less like a peace offering and more like they were trying to buy their way back into my life and my child's life. When I tried to politely decline, saying Chad and I had already started preparing for the baby, my mom got irritated. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "You can't possibly provide for this child the way we can. We're just trying to help. Don't let your pride get in the way of giving your baby the best start in life." The call wrapped up with her saying they'd send the gifts anyway, and that they expected to be involved in their grandchild's life. She didn't ask how I was feeling, how my pregnancy was going, or even how Chad was doing. It was all about the gifts and their expectations. After hanging up, Chad was livid when I told him about the call. He felt my parents were trying to undermine us and show they could provide things for our child that we couldn't. "They're trying to buy their way into our lives," he said, pacing around our small living room. "And once we accept these gifts, they'll use it as leverage to make demands about how we raise our child." I knew he had a point, but a small part of me still hoped this was just my parents' clumsy way of trying to reconnect. Maybe if we gave them a chance, they'd come around and accept Chad and our life together. "Maybe they've changed," I said, though I didn't really believe it. "Maybe becoming grandparents has made them realize what's truly important." Chad looked at me and asked, "Do you really believe that? Or are you just hoping it's true because you miss them?" His words hit home. I did miss my family, despite everything. I missed the good times, family dinners, holiday celebrations, and inside jokes that only we understood. But I also couldn't forget the bad times. The constant pressure, the disapproval, and the way they cast me aside when I didn't conform to their expectations. Chad said he'd support whatever decision I made, but I could tell he was uncomfortable with the idea of accepting anything from my parents. He was worried they'd try to exert control over our lives and our child's upbringing. "We've been doing fine on our own," he reminded me. "We don't need their money or their approval." Amber kept blowing up my phone, alternating between guilt-tripping me for holding a grudge and excitedly talking about being an aunt. She didn't seem to understand why I was hesitant to accept our parents' offer. "They're trying to make things right," she insisted. "Why can't you just let the past go?" But it wasn't that simple. The past had shaped who I am and the life I've chosen. So, Reddit, what should I do here? I really need some good advice. ***, Update 1. It's been about a month since my last post and a lot has happened. First, I want to thank everyone for their advice and support. After many discussions with Chad, we decided to decline my parents' offer. It wasn't an easy decision, but we felt it was the right one for our family. I called my mom and explained that while we appreciated the gesture, we weren't comfortable accepting such expensive gifts. I tried to keep the conversation civil and suggested that if they wanted to be part of our child's life, we could start with smaller steps, maybe a dinner together to talk things through. My mom didn't take it well. She accused me of being ungrateful and stubborn, saying I was depriving my child of opportunities out of spite. "You're making a huge mistake," she said. "You're going to regret this when your child grows up without the advantages we can provide." I stood my ground, explaining that Chad and I were capable of providing for our child, and that what we wanted from them was a relationship, not material things. The call ended with my mom hanging up on me. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. A few days later, a truck showed up at our house filled with all the gifts my mom had mentioned: the stroller, the crib, baby clothes, and even a set of keys for a new car parked on our street. There was a note attached: "For our grandchild, we won't let your stubbornness deprive them of the best." Chad and I were stunned. We didn't know what to do with all this stuff. It felt like a violation of our boundaries. We decided to put everything in the garage for the time being while we figured out what to do. Chad wanted to send it all back immediately, but I hesitated. The situation got more complicated when Amber showed up at our door the next day. She was full of excitement about the baby and the gifts, acting as if nothing had ever been wrong between us. "Isn't it wonderful?" she gushed. "Mom and Dad are so excited to be grandparents, they want to do everything they can to help." I tried to explain our position to her, but she didn't seem to understand. "Why are you being so difficult?" she asked. "Most people would be thrilled to receive such generous gifts. You're acting like Mom and Dad are the villains here." The conversation quickly turned into an argument. Amber accused me of being selfish and holding on to past grudges. "They're trying to make amends," she insisted. "Why can't you just accept their love and move on?" I lost my temper then. "Love?" I said. "Is that what you call ignoring me for 3 years and then trying to buy their way back into my life? That's not love, Amber. That's control." Amber left in a huff, telling me I was making a huge mistake. "You're going to push them away for good this time," she warned, "and it'll be your fault when your child grows up without grandparents." To complicate matters further, word has gotten out to our extended family about the situation. I've been receiving calls and messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all urging me to reconcile with my parents. "They're your parents," my Aunt Sharon said. So, during this super frustrating phone call, they were like, "Of course they want to spoil their grandchild. Why are you making it so hard?" I tried to explain that we hadn't spoken in years, and that it felt more like they were trying to buy their way back into our lives rather than genuinely reconnect. But it's tough to make people understand when they haven't lived through it. Chad was totally by my side, backing my decisions, but also giving me a different perspective when I needed it. He keeps reminding me that we don't need their money and that we're doing just fine on our own. Our kid's gonna have everything they need: love, support, and 2 parents who adore them. I'm now 16 weeks pregnant, and instead of basking in this special time, I'm feeling all sorts of stressed and conflicted. The gifts are just sitting in our garage, staring at us as we try to figure out what to do. Chad wants to donate everything to a local women's shelter, but I'm hesitating. Once we do that, it feels like we're slamming the door on any chance of making up with my parents. Meanwhile, Amber keeps flooding me with baby clothes pics and nursery ideas, acting as if everything's peachy. My parents haven't reached out since sending the gifts, but I know they're waiting for some sort of response. And the pressure from other family members is just relentless: calls and messages every day as my pregnancy progresses. We need to decide soon. We can't leave those gifts in the garage forever, and we definitely need to start prepping for the baby. But every time I think I've made up my mind, I start doubting myself again. Chad and I have even talked about seeing a family counselor to help us sort through this mess. Maybe an outsider's perspective could help us see a way forward we haven't thought of yet. For now, we're just taking it one day at a time. I'm trying to focus on the positives of my pregnancy and our life together, but the family drama is always lurking in the background. I just hope whatever decision we make is the right one for our child. Final update. It's been 6 months since my last post, and a lot has changed. After weeks of agonizing, Chad and I decided to see a family counselor. We had several sessions together and individually to sort out our feelings about the situation with my parents. The counselor really helped us figure out our priorities and how to set up healthy boundaries. During this time, the pressure from my family got even worse. My parents, frustrated by our radio silence, started showing up at our house unannounced, banging on the door for hours and insisting they just wanted to talk. It was super stressful, especially with the physical discomforts of pregnancy. Amber kept guilt-tripping me, sending daily messages about how I was tearing the family apart. She even threatened to cut me out of her life if I didn't make up with our parents, even though we hadn't really been talking for years. The turning point came when I was about 32 weeks pregnant. My parents showed up at my workplace, causing a huge scene in the lobby and demanding to see me, saying they had a right to be part of their grandchild's life. My coworkers were totally uncomfortable, and my boss had to step in and ask them to leave or he'd call the police. That incident made me realize my parents hadn't changed at all. They were still trying to control my life and ignoring my boundaries and wishes. It wasn't about love or reconciliation. It was about getting their way, no matter what. After talking it over with Chad and our counselor, we made the tough decision to go no contact with my parents and Amber. We sent a formal cease and desist letter through a lawyer, stating that any further attempts to contact us would be considered harassment. We donated all the baby gifts to a local women's shelter like Chad had suggested months ago. It was hard to let go of them, but it felt right. We didn't want our child's life starting with strings attached. The day after we sent the letter, I blocked my parents and Amber on everything. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but also one of the most freeing. The constant stress and anxiety started to lift almost immediately. Our daughter Susan was born 2 months ago. The birth was complicated, and there were moments when I really wished my mom was there. But Chad was amazing throughout the whole process, and we got through it together. These first few weeks of parenthood have been challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. Susan is perfect, and watching Chad with her makes me fall in love with him all over again. We might not have all the fancy stuff my parents wanted to give us, but we have love, and that's more than enough. Looking at Susan, I'm more certain than ever that we made the right choice. I want her to grow up in a home filled with love and respect, not constant judgment and control. I want her to know her worth isn't tied to money or status, but to who she is as a person. Sure, she won't have the materialistic perks my parents could have provided, but she'll have parents who love her unconditionally and support her dreams, whatever they may be. She'll grow up knowing it's okay to set boundaries, stand up for herself, and choose her own path in life. This journey has been tough, but I don't regret our decision. We're moving forward, focusing on our little family and the bright future ahead of us. Thanks to everyone who supported us through this journey. Your advice and kind words meant more than you know. Here's to new beginnings and choosing happiness, even when it's the harder path.